Good morning. Good to see everyone here this morning. We're so glad that you're here. I know that there's even some that aren't here, but they're here. They're joining us online, so we're glad to have them with us here today as well. And we're starting a new series today. We're going to talk a little bit about how Jesus handled, but none of us in here have any conflicts, right? No. So I will not be preaching to anybody that needs this series. So I guess I'll just be preaching to myself. But no, I'm really excited about this series because the fact is, conflict, it impacts us all, right? And it comes in a lot of different forms and in a lot of different ways. You know, like for instance, this morning I was just thinking, you know, I was praying, I'm like, I really hope there isn't any conflict at our church this morning between Purdue fans and Ohio State fans today. I was praying for that this morning, all right? Because, you know, that wouldn't be a good thing, all right? But nonetheless, conflict is something that pops up in our lives a lot, doesn't it? And it comes in a variety of ways. You know, for instance, you know, we run into it in our workplaces, we run into it in our families, we run into it in our marriages. And the way that it kind of manifests itself is different. Sometimes it's kind of an unspoken conflict. Other times it's very spoken, very vocal, right? Very out in the public. Sometimes it's private. Conflict comes in a variety of ways. And I got to be thinking several months back, and I was thinking of a series to do this fall. I was like, okay, conflict is something that's in each of our lives. So how did Jesus handle conflict? And at first, you know, you want to say, well, Jesus was God's son. Jesus was perfect. So that must mean that Jesus didn't have any conflict. Right? You know, Jesus, because he was perfect, he was sinless, he didn't run into any problems with people. Well, you can read throughout the Gospels and see that there were many conflicts that took place with Jesus. The difference, though, between us and him, of course, is that he handled it correctly. We often do not, right? And let me tell you one time that I didn't handle it correctly. So, one of the early conflicts, I guess you would say, within my marriage was over my trophies. Okay, I've shared this before. Maybe it's a problem I've got. I don't know. I need to get some counseling over this. Okay, but when we got married, I thought I was a pretty good baseball player when I was younger. I got all these trophies. You know, I had them up. It was kind of like my little personal shrine to Danny. You know, and you know, I thought, man, I'm great. Of course, once I get into high school, I realized I'm not all that good, okay? But, you know, I went back, I talked about this a few weeks ago, went back to the good old days, right, you know, and so I had these trophies. Well, I got married, and my wife, Adriana, she's asking me, well, why do you have all these trophies? And I'm sitting there thinking, well, because, you know, and I gave all these lame excuses, right? Well, finally, you know, I want to say this, I almost felt like it was a personal affront to Danny, you know, to get rid of, you know, the trophies that I got like 30 years ago. You know, that's a personal affront to me. And so the whole thing just kind of got bigger and it got bigger and it got bigger because, you know what, because I thought for sure that I was right. I was right in this. She's wrong, I'm right. And you know what happens? Our rightness only makes conflict worse. You know, when we come into a conflict and a disagreement with others, when we want to think that we're right. And so we buckle down, you know, we camp out in this place where we say that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And that's where I wasn't. All of us today, when we go back and we think of conflicts that we've had in our life, you could probably, if you were to just boil it down, you could boil it down to a situation where you thought that you were right and you weren't going to give an inch. Now, some of these things, some of these conflicts that we've had in our lives, we've long past moved from. You know, we've moved away from them. Now, when I say we moved away from them, though, some of us have truly moved away from them, where we think, okay, it wasn't a big deal, I'm moving on from it. But then some of us move away from it, though, but we really haven't. It's kind of like this grudge. It's this thing that's still in our hearts, and we still think to ourselves, I know that I'm right. And so what happens is that when we have this idea of being right, this rightness, then it kind of boils over into other things. And so our conflict, when we are stuck in this idea of rightness, it makes conflict worse. And really, if you think about it, our rightness often stands in direct opposition to God's grace. And that's what we're going to talk about today as we're talking about conflict. You know, conflict, while it comes in many forms, grace should be something that finds its way into every conflict that we have. Now, for some of us, that's easy. For some of us, we can show grace and forgiveness really quick. For others of us, it's more difficult. But when we look throughout Jesus' ministry, we're going to see here in a few minutes, Jesus showed grace even in the midst of some really bad conflict. And our rightness, when we stand firm and we will not forgive, when we will not show grace, when we stand firm in our rightness, we're standing in the way of God's will. The more we dig in our heels, the worse the conflict gets. I know this because I know it from experience. And guess what? I bet you do too. We're all in this together, right? We're all in this together. And you know, when we look at our culture, we look at our families, we look at people around us, we see this happen in a lot of different ways. You know, we see politicians that sometimes they'll do something wrong, and then what will happen is then rather than admitting that they've done something wrong, what do? They try to cover it up, right? I'm right, I'm not having anybody else tell me that I'm wrong. And so then what we end up doing is we come up with new pieces to the conflict. We add more to it. Because we won't show grace to ourselves, and then because we're afraid other people won't show grace to us. And I want to tell you today, I think we've got it a little mixed up, because maybe it shouldn't be so much about showing grace to ourselves and others, or worried about others, although we should show grace to ourselves, although we should want other people to show us grace. But we have to remember it's about the grace of Christ that's been extended to us, that should enable us to move past our mistake and to admit it and to seek forgiveness and to seek God's grace. But, you know, we see politicians do that. We see that within our marriages sometimes. A spouse will dig their heels in, even though that they're wrong, they will just fight and say that they're right. And what does it do? It makes things worse. We see it at work. Maybe your boss, or maybe if you're a boss, an employee, right? They do something wrong and you're like, okay, this isn't right, and they just dig their heels in. And what does it do? It makes conflict worse. Our rightness makes conflict worse. But Jesus wants us to realize that we have to get away from our rightness. And we have to instead focus on His grace. Jesus teaches us that grace has the biggest place in conflict. It should have the biggest place. You know, if there is somebody that would have a really hard time showing grace, it would be Jesus. Because think about the burden. Now, some of you may think you have this burden, okay? Think about the burden of being right 100% of the time. Now, some of you in here might think you have that burden. I want you to know that you don't, okay? You're not right 100% of the time, okay? But Jesus did have that burden, and it was a burden. Because think about it, for 30 plus years, He lives in a world full of people who, a bunch of screwballs, right? I mean, I don't know how else to say it, right? I mean, for 30 years throughout His whole ministry, I mean, He's sitting here, I can imagine, you know, He's sitting there and teaching, and some of the questions we even see in the Gospels, He's sitting there, and everything within Him, although He's perfect, and I'm looking at this from a human perspective, but if it were me, I'd be sitting here like rolling my eyes, like, seriously? You know, what? You know, sometimes maybe I'd want to be pulling my hair out. I just want to storm out of there like, you idiots, I'm gone, you know. I mean, Jesus could have done all these things, but He didn't, because He was the very epitome of grace. And we see this in certain instances. Like, for instance, when Jesus was being questioned by the teachers of the law, when there was questions from His disciples, you know what? He could have jumped right into the fray and caused great conflict, but instead He was patient, He loved those that He listened to, and He did what was right. I want to read an interesting passage in Mark chapter 9. In Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 37, there's 5 verses here that I want to look at, because it's interesting, all right? In verse 33 here, it's Jesus, and He's with His disciples, and it says here that they came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, because they'd been walking along, you know, they get to the house, and He asks them, what were you arguing about on the road? They had been arguing. You know, it's kind of like, I got this image like Jesus is in front, and like all the disciples are behind him, and they're all fighting kind of like the kids in the back seat, right? You know, they're all like, hey, you know, and here's what they were fighting about. They kept quiet, and this is funny to me. This is where the humor in the word comes out. They kept quiet because on the way they argued about who was the greatest. That sounds like fights like I have with my brothers and, you know, and my siblings, you know, in the back seat of the car, you know. We're back there arguing with each other about, well, I'm better than you at this, and I'm doing, you know, that's kind of what's going on here. They're back there, and so then, you know, Dad, Jesus, right? He's like, so what were you guys arguing? He knew what they were arguing about, you know. What were you guys arguing about back there? And silence, right? Just silence. You know, I can remember that happening with my parents sometimes. We'd argue, and my mom would be like, what's going on? And we just, you know, we're just quiet. We wouldn't say, well, that's what's happening here with the disciples. They were arguing about who was the best. Now, you might think, well, I've never done that, even as an adult. But we do that. I mean, when we criticize other people, the reason why we criticize and we degrade and put down other people is because we think we're better, right? Usually when you boil it down. You know, I can remember my friends in high school, middle school, we did a lot of trash talking about our sports skills, you know, in basketball or whatever. We could be like the worst basketball or baseball player ever, but we would still say, well, I'm better than you, and we do the trash talking. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. I mean, the disciples throughout their ministry, this ministry that Jesus, when Jesus was here with them on this world, they saw all the times that they messed up. You know, they knew that they weren't perfect, but yet they had to find a way to say that they were the best. And the reason why they were silent when Jesus asked them this question was because it flew in the face of everything that Jesus had taught them. They knew better. We know better, right? And yet what do? We continue to fan the flames of conflict. You know, I would even say that when it says here that they had grown quiet, that shame had kind of creeped in, right? Here it is, they've been arguing about who was great. Now you have almost a total 180 here, but now they're saying, oh, man. So shame has crept in and they're quiet. Everybody there, those disciples, they knew that there was a problem. They knew there was a problem in what was taking place in this conversation. But guess what? Surprise, surprise, nobody wanted to talk about it. We'll get back to that here in a minute. Let's go on to the next verse, 35. So sitting down, so I you know, sometimes little phrases we kind of overlook, you know, when we're reading a text. But when I look at this and I think, okay, here they are arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus is saying, okay, what's going on? And everybody's quiet. What does Jesus do? It says Jesus sits down. Doesn't give us this idea that Jesus goes into a fit of rage, right? He's like, I can't believe this. I've been teaching you guys this for all this time, and you're back there arguing about who's the great. No, he didn't go into that. He just sits down. Jesus a few times with my kids. Sometimes I didn't just sit down, okay? Because that's where my fallen nature comes in. Jesus, what does he do? He sits down and he calls them together and he says, anyone who wants to be the first must be the very last and the servant of all. What I love about this is that Jesus could have done a couple things. One of them I already told you. He could have gone into a fit of rage right over this. Or he could have ignored it. He could have said, well, disciples will be disciples, you know, and you just move on. But that's not what he did. He didn't let them ignore the conflict, nor did he jump their case over it. That's a hard line to find, isn't it, in conflict? Usually we either want to jump people's case or we just ignore it and push it off. How is Jesus able to do this? Because he knew and he knows the nature of humanity. He knows us. He knows that on the one hand, it doesn't do any good to go into a fit of rage because it's just going to make it worse. But on the flip side, he also knows you can't ignore it because then it makes it worse too. He knows us. He knew them. And that's why he confronted them with it in this way. He also knew something else that's really important. This is something that we have got. This is probably one of the most basic and essential pieces to conflict resolution in our relationships. Okay? And it's the idea that everybody involved in conflict is selfish. Sometimes when we're in a conflict with another person, we might think to ourselves, well, they're selfish and it's all about them, but I'm looking at this with like as pure as a dove, and I'm looking at this with the greatest of intent and intentions, and you know what, maybe you are on the most part, but let me tell you, your nature, the Bible reminds us of this all the time, we are selfish. That's important to remember. And that's what Jesus remembered in this. He remembered that, hey, the nature of these guys is that they're selfish. It's about them. And so I'm not just going to let this slide by, but I'm not going to jump all over them, because if I had to jump over them, I'd have to jump over the other, billions of people that's lived throughout history, right? I mean, our nature, but he also knew that we shouldn't just ignore it. Now, if you go on to verse 36. Boy, Jesus really punched him below the belt here, right? He took a little child. Nothing like getting a kid to make you feel bad, right? He took a little child whom he placed among them, and taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Had to bring in the kids, Jesus. But you know what? Jesus brings this child in because he wanted to ground these men. He wants to ground us. He wants us to realize, hey, you know what? You might think you're all grown up and you've got it all figured out. But guess what? We can learn from kids. With gentleness. He says, there's been a lot of interpretation about what Jesus was trying to get across with a kid. Why would he bring a kid into this? And I believe that if you have to realize this. So in our culture today, children have been given a very elevated status within our culture. We put a lot in financially into our schools. We have all these clubs and programs for kids, sports, the list goes on, right? We put a heavy investment in children. In Jesus' day, that was not the case. Children were just seen as a commodity. They were seen as kind of like, I guess what we would say, like Social Security, right? You have kids, they'll be there to take care of you when you're older. But it wasn't like it is today. Children were at the very lowest rung of society. And what Jesus was trying to do here by bringing a kid into this argument was to say, hey, listen, these kids represent the lowest of society, and yet you should welcome them, you should love them, you should be like them, you should serve other people rather than be served. This would have been a very, and again, I think it's hard for us because of where we're at in our culture, but for the disciples to be told this would have been very jarring. It would have got their attention. See, what Jesus, I think, would tell us today is this: when it comes to conflict and grace, and the disciples, they loved this, but they didn't know how to show it. The fact is this: is that you love grace, so you have to show conflict. You know what? You love forgiveness. You love mercy. You love this. I mean, we sing songs about it, right? And we're like, oh, that's so great when we're singing it, that God shows us grace. And man, is it good, isn't it? It's so good to get God's grace. But so often in our conflict, we don't show it. We just don't show it. This morning I was, I get some posts from there's a guy that I follow for church stuff, and he was talking about why people don't go to church. And so I did something really dangerous for a preacher, okay? I looked at the comments, okay, that were under this post. And it was just heartbreaking to me to see person after person that went on there and talked about how they had not been shown grace by Christians. People talking about grace and loving Jesus, and yet they haven't experienced that themselves. See, if we're going to find resolution in our conflicts, we have to show grace. We have to show love. And so here's some lessons, okay? I'm gonna try to be super practical with us today. Okay, here are some lessons for us about grace and conflict that we learned from this text that Jesus shows us, all right? So here's the first one, all right? The first one is this. A key lesson from Jesus about grace and conflict is this. Number one, you need to acknowledge the conflict. Sometimes when we get in the middle of a conflict with someone else, what do we try to do? We try to ignore it, or sometimes we allow our pride to blind us. We try to craft it, or we try to look at it in a way that's just simply not true. It doesn't exist. We try to make it out into something that's not there. We can't allow our pride to get in the way of what a conflict really looks like. You know, not acknowledging a problem will never solve it, nor can grace be applied if we are unwilling to admit it. Okay? Let's pull up the next slide here. Not acknowledging the problem will never solve it, nor can grace be applied if we are never willing to admit it. You know, if we don't acknowledge what the problem is, and we don't look at what that problem is, and try to discover more deeply what that problem is, we will never solve the problem. It will never be resolved. And grace can never be applied if we won't admit that there's a problem. And I think that's where grace is often left out in our conflicts, because you can't apply grace if you don't think you need it. We have to be willing to allow grace to come into our conflict. And here's the thing. Our fallen nature tries to tell us that pain is avoided by leaving conflict unspoken. Let me tell you, the opposite is true. I can tell you over and again through the years of counseling and talking to people that our fallen nature, that the evil that's within our world, is trying to tell us that pain is best avoided if we just don't talk about it. We just don't pretend we just pretend it's not there. And we carried on with this, and you know what? For maybe a week or two, or maybe a month, we don't think about it. It's kind of pushed off. But then it comes back, and when it comes back, oh boy, when it comes back like a freight train in your life, right? I mean, I've talked to people who had things happen to them decades ago that are struggling deeply because they've never really acknowledged it and never really allowed grace to be applied to it. We have to get better at this. We have to acknowledge the conflict. You know, and sometimes conflict isn't resolved because it's embarrassing, right? We don't want to talk about it. It can be a really big embarrassment, or it can be some kind of private embarrassment, but we don't talk about it. And so we continue to live in this world of shame. Let me tell you, God doesn't want you to live in this world, in that world of shame. When we bring it out in the open and we talk about it, and we allow grace to be applied to it, we can really, truly find healing. See, that's what Jesus was trying to do with the disciples. He was bringing out this idea of who was the best, right? They all thought they were the best. He was trying to bring it out in the open. He's like, you got to deal with this now. He knew what was ahead for them. He knew the many years of ministry, the persecution they were going to endure. We better talk about this now. Let me tell you, I know there's something in your life today that you really need to talk about now. Now, who that is, you need to talk to someone you trust. You need to talk to someone who is godly. That one's really important. You know, the advice you get is only as good as the Holy Spirit's work in that person's life. And if you're going to somebody that isn't godly, doesn't have the Holy Spirit in their life, you better be careful. But we have to find someone and we have to talk about these things. We have to acknowledge the conflict that is there. You know, in some conflict we don't resolve because we're embarrassed, maybe for the person that there's the conflict with. And so what do? We don't want to put the effort in to try to walk through them with it. You know, it's a lot of hard work walking with somebody through something that's tough. You know, there's a passage in James chapter 5, verse 19. James writes, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, then someone should bring that person back. Remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. You know what? To live out that verse is tough stuff, because that means we have to walk with them in that conflict, in that stuff. I don't know who your conflict is with right now, but you know what? If you're going to solve the conflict with them and the tension with them, you got to walk through some tough stuff. You know, when I'm as guilty as anyone else, I sometimes tend to want to just kind of stay away from it because it's hard. It's hard work. But we have to remember that grace can be applied if we just put in that hard work. You know, another thing, it says for us, from Jesus about grace and conflict. Acknowledge the fallenness of everyone that's involved. It goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. You know what? We forget that everybody, every party in any conflict or disagreement is selfish, including you. And this is so essential because if every party, if both parties in this conflict would realize that, then everybody could come together and talk through it, admit their own faults, admit where maybe where they're right too, right? And be able to walk through it together, and they can find that resolution to their conflict. But both parties have to agree to this. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. So what do? What you might be thinking, okay, Dan, well, this is great. Yeah, all the conflict if everybody would just acknowledge their fallenness. But what if the other person doesn't want to do that? Guess what? It has to start with you. It has to start with you. You can't control how another person's going to think or respond to a conflict that you're in, but you can allow the Holy Spirit in your life to do something in you. That's hard because every fabric of our being, right, just wants us to resist that. No, if they're not going to admit they're wrong, I'm not going to admit I'm wrong, and it's tough. Somebody has to start somewhere. Admit your fallenness. Now, the third thing Jesus teaches us, seek the truth in love. We have to do the improbable within conflict, and that is to put somebody else before ourselves. With someone, guess what? You might actually have to give an inch or two or three or a foot or a mile or two. But you know what? We seek out the truth and we do it in love. We want the other person to see God's truth, but we don't do it with hate. We don't do it with anger, or at least the wrong kind of anger. We're going to talk about anger here in a couple of weeks. But we have to stick to the truth, but we do it with love. Let me tell you this. If we are as right as all could be, if we have everything right in our life, but we don't do it with love, we're a resounding gong, right? The scripture says. Clanging cymbal. We're just a bunch of noise. You know what? I think a lot of us are a bunch of noise. I hate to say that, but I think it's true. In my own life, it's true. I mean, noise. We know, but we don't do. We have to seek the truth in love. I want to read a longer passage here from in Luke chapter 14. So Jesus, the hardest thing for a person who has gained some notoriety, especially when they're a controversial notoriety person like Jesus was, is to return back to where they're from. All right? And here's what it says in verse 14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. News about him spread through the whole countryside, and he was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So then he rolled up the scroll, and he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. So they were looking at him. And he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." He's saying, the prophecy has been fulfilled in me, right? All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. And Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy at the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And all the people in the synagogue," and I want to stop here for just a second. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. So they liked what Jesus had to say, but if he didn't turn into their little trick pony, did all kinds of things for him. It changed, right? He was sharing with them the truth. He was sharing them love, but what happened? All the people get furious. And look at verse 29. Not only did they get furious, I mean, it went even further. They got up, they drove Jesus out of town. Wait a minute, this is Jesus. He doesn't ever have conflict in his life, right? He drove him out of town, took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. Now that's some interesting conflict resolution right there, right? Just take him outside town, throw him over a cliff. Oh, it's all fixed, right? Boy, boy. But look what Jesus did. Jesus didn't fly off the handle at him. He didn't say, oh, you know. No, he walked right through the crowd and he went on his way. He stood by the truth, but he did it in love, even when people were about to kill him. That's a tough standard, isn't it? But let me tell you, it's one that's so important if we're going to find resolution in our conflicts. You know, the fourth thing here is this, and this one's an interesting one, I think. Serve the one that you are in conflict with. You know, it's really hard to be mad and in conflict with someone when you're serving them. You know, sometimes, I don't know about you, this has been me many times. Sometimes it's hard for me to intellectually, like, sit there and say, okay, I forgive somebody, I'm ready to move on. It's hard for me to get there. So maybe a good way to get to that place is to serve people until I get to that place. Sometimes my mind takes, you know, in my heart, you know, it's harder to bring it along, it's slower. But if I just get out front and say, okay, I'm just going to serve them, I'm going to be there for them, I'm going to love them, then eventually I get there. You know what, I think this point, this lesson here, this key, is a good one for those of us that maybe are in a conflict that the other person doesn't want to do anything about it. You can serve that person, you can love that person to a place where you can find a resolution to that conflict even if they don't. I mean, that's what Jesus did. Jesus served people throughout his ministry who were in conflict with him. He was there to serve the people of his hometown there in Nazareth that day. Even though he didn't do exactly what they wanted him to do, he still loved them. He was still there for them. And we have to serve. We have to do it again. In chapter 17, Jesus said, watch yourselves. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them. And if they repent, forgive them. And even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, I repent, you must forgive them. What is the point here? Jesus is saying we have to continue to forgive over and over again. And one of the best ways we can serve a person is to give them forgiveness. Now, we're going to get into some more of this later, but when we do show forgiveness, we can show forgiveness and yet not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of, all right? I think I want to draw a line of distinction there. Jesus doesn't say, well, just keep letting them hurt you over and over. No. But we can do things to forgive people because that is what Jesus would do. That is what Jesus has called us to do. And so my challenge today is a pretty simple one. I thought a lot a few weeks ago when I was writing this. I was thinking, okay, what would be a really catchy, good challenge here, you know, with this? And I thought, I don't think there is a need for I think the material itself that we've looked at today challenges us enough. But I will say this, here's our challenge, right? What conflict in your life right now needs some grace? What conflict, and maybe it's just something that happened this week, but what conflict in your life right now needs grace? And this week, I want to challenge you to look at these key lessons that we looked at, and how can we apply that within that conflict? How can we acknowledge it? Acknowledge my own fallenness in that conflict. How can I seek the truth in love? How can I serve that person that I'm in conflict with? Which or all of those lessons you need to apply to the conflict that you're currently undergoing in your life? You know, if you're a student today, I know this week, maybe it'd be a little harder to practice it because you're on fall break this week I know Western Wayne is. If you're a student though, I want you to think this week, maybe there's a grudge that you're holding on to that for a long time that you just won't acknowledge. Maybe there's this kid at school that's drove you crazy, or maybe they've done something harsh to you and you find it really hard to forgive them. Maybe this week you need to acknowledge that with them. You need to say, hey, listen, I know that we haven't gotten along, we have some issues with one another. Let's talk about it. Let's work through this a little bit, you know. Maybe one way you could do that is by serving them, right? Maybe you could help them on a project at school or do some schoolwork, right? Help them with some schoolwork. There's different things that we can do in order to be able to love people and to forgive people and to move past that conflict. Same thing at work. You know, at work, the same thing happens, right? Maybe there's another person that you just don't get along with. Maybe you get into the habit that often happens when we have conflict, and that is we resort to talking poorly about them, right, behind their backs. Maybe we need to confront that conflict right away. We need to acknowledge that. Maybe we need to serve them, help them out with something at work. Try to build a bridge where that conflict can be resolved. Or how about in our relationships? You know, our family members, we're coming in. I told you last week that I was wondering about the series going closer to Christmas. This is the perfect series because at Christmas time, you can have a lot of tension, right? Especially when everybody comes over to visit. You're in the same house together, right? Things just can get a little testy, okay? Maybe we need to acknowledge the conflict with our family members. Be willing to talk through it and find resolution. Serve them, love them. Even when every selfish, cell in your body wants you to not, you just go ahead and get ahead of your heart and go ahead and serve and love. But whatever it is, we all need to show some grace in our conflicts. And if we do this, think about what would happen if we do this. If we do this, we could show the world that there's a different way to handle conflict. Because let me tell you, our world needs a different way, doesn't it? Our world isn't doing a very good job handling conflict. Just like they tried to kill Jesus by throwing him over a cliff, what do we like to do? We like to go to war and kill millions of each other. Our world, the direction that we're going, the brokenness, needs a different way. And we as the church can show that. We can be the different way. And you know what? All you have to do is go onto the pages of Facebook and Twitter to see that there's a lot of love and a lot of conflict resolution that's needed. And we can bring that there. See, the thing is if we want the world to be different in the way that it handles its conflict, it has to start with us. And I think sometimes we wait for the other person or society or culture, whatever, to get their act together. No, it has to start with us. It has to start with us. You know, I started at the beginning of my message today. I mentioned to you about my trophies, And eventually I'm slowly come around, right? I think I have anyway. I don't talk about it as much as I used to. Because they're just trophies. They were signs of vanity. It's funny, there's a song. Some of you in here that know the hymn pretty well. There's a song that goes like this. It was the old rugged cross. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. And one of the phrases that has always jumped out at me there in that song is this. When my trophies at last I lay down. My trophies was he talking about baseball trophies? Of course he wasn't. He was talking about all of our accomplishments, all of our pride, all of our vanity, all of our. That is what we have to lay down if we're going to find conflict resolution. And it starts with grace. Grace is how we lay it down. And Jesus laid it all down. You talk about somebody who had to lay down all their trophies. Jesus laid aside everything to come into this world and to be among us and to love us and to sit there in those conversations where people were saying the craziest stuff like his disciples were that day, when he could have just flew off the handle, but he didn't because of grace. So my challenge for us this week, our challenge is to reach out to those who we're in conflict with and show them grace. Will you do that this week, okay? Let's pray. God, we thank you for what you've taught us today. Showing grace in the middle of conflict is not. God, I know full well this message today is a hard one. And like many of the messages, I've got the easy part. I come up here and share what your word has to say. It's now we have to get out there and do it. God, I pray you would give us the courage and the humility that's needed, God, to be able to reach out and resolve conflict with those who are hurting or who have hurt us. God, help us to show your grace. And And God, I thank you that you sent your son Jesus. You know, the greatest schism, the greatest conflict that's ever happened in history is what we've done to you. How we decided those many years ago that we knew better than you. Ever since, it's been one ginormous mess. And that's found its way into our lives. And yet, God, you didn't allow your pride and your vanity that you could have had to get in the way, because that's not who you are. You stepped down into this world on your Son. You loved us and you taught us, and ultimately you died for us. God, I thank you for teaching us, for showing us what it means to live with grace in the midst of conflict. God, help us to show that in our own lives today. And God, I pray for anyone that's here today, God. I know that there's probably someone here today, God, that's in conflict with you in the sense that they have not found that grace in their life through Jesus Christ. And Father, I pray that they would turn their life over to you. God, that they would see that the war is over, that all we got to do is raise our white flag and say that we surrender it all. And that you, Lord, are victor. And you're not just a victor for yourself, you're a victor for us. And we that victor if we just lay ourselves down. Lay our trophies down. God, thank you for the reminder today. Thank you for being a good Father, a loving Father, a grace-filled Father. We pray all this in Jesus' name.